Okay, I stopped last lecture at Simon Bolivar struggle for independence. Now he's leading the movement, the struggle for independence in Latin America. And that was happening against the backdrop or the events that took place in Spain with disposing the crown and then putting him back or returning to the throne. And then the colonial authority managed to crush the independence movement, and Bolivar now had been forced into exile in New Granada first, and then Jamaica. So what happened in Mexico and in Peru during that period? So in Mexico, the church or some priests or from the church tried to take the lead in this struggle for independence in this part of the continent. So Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla in Mexico during that period in 1810 as well, they tried to ignite and incite rebellion against the colonial authority and to recruit, some supporters in their armed struggle for independence. And Hidalgo actually reached Mexico City, and he had been invading or circled the city, but he actually refrained from invading the city, and he was captured there and executed by the royalists or the supporters for the Spanish authority. And then Jose Maria Morales, he actually continued what Hidalgo started, but he added another social elements to the national struggle. So by trying not to lose, this momentum with regard to this struggle or armed struggle for independence, another priest actually did follow the same path, and he tried to add another social element or radical element to this nationalist discourse. Morales actually, instead of focusing only on nationalism and liberation struggle, he actually added some social element by asking for abolishing Indian tributes and slavery, and he asked also for far-reaching agrarian reforms in order to put an end to oligarchical power in the rural areas. So actually he added, to another component to nationalism, he added this social and racial equality in order to attract more supporters from indigenous or non-elite, in order to make it somehow non-elitist. And again, as Bolivar did, when the Congress of the Viceroyalty convened in 1813, it made this declaration of independence. But again, the royal authorities or proponents for or supporters for the Spanish crown managed to quell the nationalist movement and put an end to this struggle through the trial by inquisition. And again, Morales was, as it happened with Hidalgo, Morales again was executed, and temporarily, the Spanish authority had managed to put an end to this nationalist deal in the continent. So the Spanish military advantage had or this kind of suppressive power had proved its resilience in order to, for a short time, put an end and quell this independence movement, but it didn't last for so long. After a few years, 3 years or something, Bolivar managed to go back again to Venezuela and to resume the struggle for independence. But this time, he actually had an alliance with another proponent or advocate for independence in Spain, Jose Antonio Baez, with the help of the British authority, in order to ignite to sustain this struggle for independence in Spanish America. And he managed in 3 years, in 1819, he gained full control over Venezuela. And he had this dream of establishing this American Federation, and he managed to establish or to give birth to Gran Colombia in 1821, and it was like made consisted of Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador, and actually the union lasted until 1830, and then similar military campaign occurred in the south, basically in Peru and Bolivia, as we know today. So the campaign actually was led by military leader or strategist San Martin. He was not a politician, so that's why he had kind of edge or advantage with regard to military planning or military strategy, but he didn't have like this skill in political governance or political bargaining and negotiation. So that's why when he reached, like he was about to invade Peru, it had like this strong existence of royalist and conservative elements and conservative class that they actually needed to preserve their social position, and they had been, or they were worried about this independence movement. So that's why he had to negotiate with them in order to liberate this part of the continent, mainly Peru and Bolivia, and it was back then it was upper Peru. So actually, because of the strong presence of this monarchist supporters in Lima or Peru, he had to he reached out to Bolivar, and they had to meet and negotiate how to convince this conservative class or the conservative bloc in Peru in order to accept the independence, instead of igniting hatred or antagonism between nationalist or this national liberation movement and the conservative class in Peru. He tried to negotiate with them some sort in order to arrive or to agree on terms of independence. And then he resigned and he left the matter to Bolivar in order to lead again, this part, and to convince and to pull them into the union or the confederation he established. So now, like Bolivar reached Peru, but before like initiating this kind of negotiation and bargain with the monarchist supporters, they tried the actually, ironically, they themselves fought for independence, because they were worried about the events or what was happening in Spain with this liberal opening, and this would like resonate with the Latin American context or with the Spanish America, and then they would lose their prominent and dominant position in the area. So that's why they started, to lead or to concede to this independence demands and to this kind of negotiation for independence, and instead of fighting against or resisting nationalists or the liberation leaders. So that's why before, like even before Bolivar tried to convince them, Upper Peru, Bolivia today, the regional leaders actually, they took the lead and they announced this kind of independence, and they proclaimed Bolivar president for life. But again, it was like they refused, to be part of his Gran Colombia or his union, and that's why his kind of this dream of unification actually did fall apart. And then in a few years, in 1830, Venezuela and Ecuador as well withdrew from the Gran Colombia Federation, and this nationalist zeal actually took hold in the entire region. In Mexico, what happened again, the royalists, that they resisted before the national liberation or the independence movement, they themselves took the lead in this struggle for independence from the colonial power. So the conservative elements there, they led the struggle for independence. The prominent leader was Augustin Iturbide, and he tried to, as I mentioned, it was not radical. Like the liberation movement was not a radical movement. It was, the main concern was preserving and retaining the same privileges, social and economic privileges, and to sustain the same conservative social order. So that's why some basic calculations. So they decided to support the independence from Spain, or from the Spanish crown, or from the Spanish authority. So again, like the church and these like conservative forces, they coalesced in order and converged on the demands for independence. That happened in Mexico and Central America. And by like 1826, all Spanish America got liberated from colonial authorities and viceroyalties. So what happened in Brazil? As I mentioned, it was like the Portuguese colonization was a bit different, because like the Portuguese military capacity was different or weaker from the Spanish military capacity. So it was a little bit less bloody when we compare this to the Spanish authority or the Spanish colonial power. So what happened, again, like this kind of European the competition between different European powers after with the emergence of the military power of Napoleon Bonaparte in France, and in order to assert the hegemonic position of France during that period. So what happened? They invaded the army, the Napoleonic army actually invaded Iberia in 1807, and then pushed or forced all the Portuguese crown into exile. And they had like the only resort was they actually calculated it, and they actually established or re-established their empire in Brazil in 1808. So that was with the help of the British authority as well. So now like the exiled Portuguese monarch now in Brazil, and they tried to take on a mission of modernizing the entire country. As I mentioned, they didn't care about establishing this vast bureaucratic apparatus, and except for like the coastal area, in order to establish some trade centers and to facilitate the export of some agricultural goods. So now they had a mission to modernize Brazil, and they established, the extensive, transportation system and extensive, infrastructure in order to modernize Rio de Janeiro. And they re-established, their rule or monarchical power now in Brazil. And after the withdrawal of the French army from Portugal, Dom João decided, to return or to go back to Portugal, but he actually nominated his son Dom Pedro as the crown prince in this combined kingdom, and this triggered resentment, or they triggered, like wide dissatisfaction among Brazilian landowners. They started to lose their own social position in the face of what they called Portuguese recolonizers. So they started to form an alliance from Brazilian landowners and urban professional in order to fight, to fight against, this Portuguese recolonization. So with the help, again, with the British power or the British authority, they launched, this low-scale armed struggle against the presence of Portuguese authority in Brazil. So and it was like it was not that bloody. So that's why the rebels, with the help of the English military officers, they managed to knock them out from Brazil and to force them back into the ocean. So it was, as again, like the alliance, from the components of this alliance for independence, landowners and urban professional. So it was like a conservative alliance. So there was no kind of uh, heated disagreement over, or dispute over the polity structure. So they decided whether to keep the monarchy or to establish a new republic, for example. Coming from this conservative background, so they decided to maintain or to preserve the same socioeconomic order and the same polity structure. So the monarchy actually perpetuated or sustained its existence until 1889. So now, by 1830, the entire continent, or the entire region, got liberated from any colonial authority. So the as some conservative elements led the struggle for independence, and with this deeply entrenched power structure of landowners and Creoles in the region, they managed to sustain their dominant position in the post-independence period. So the post-independence state, it actually was dominated by these oligarchical forces, basically from landowners and from Creole families and landowners. And in the military was the only or avenue for mestizos and mixed blood to get some sort of social mobilization. So like the landowners and the military were the main centers of power. And landowners and the actually, or Creoles or Creole families, they actually established this kind of isolated fiefdom. So they didn't care much about political governance, and they left these kind of political matters and ruling the countries um, um, to actually military leaders and what was called like caudillos, the military authority, or the people from the military. They actually took the lead in governing the post-independence countries. But this period, with landowners and some like Creole families or hacendados, they didn't care much about national politics. They left the political landscape to military leaders to govern, but there had been some sort of inter-elite conflicts. And with these kind of inter-elite conflicts, to establish it's basically over centralizing the authority that would undermine and erode the power bases, or the regional and local power bases for of these regional elites and landowners in the countryside. So this kind of inter-elite conflicts established some sort of hegemony and dominance of military leader over politics in order to run the political affairs, or the tasks of governance. These were totally left by landowners and Creole families, that they didn't care much about politics, and they actually focused heavily on their economic activities. So they actually pulled, by focusing exclusively on these economic matters and agro exports and developing, trade or commercial ties, overseas. They pulled, the region or Latin America into the international market, and they tried to accumulate their economic wealth. So again, they inherited this sort of liberal economy or capitalist economy by like relegating the state to the margin and focusing on free trade and no kind of no restrictions whatsoever on importing and exporting the goods. And this actually gave superiority to the manufactured goods came from Europe, because the domestic, industrial sector or domestic goods were not able to cope with this sort of fierce competition. So they maintained this agrarian-based economy, and they tried to expand this export-import growth activities, and that it didn't help much. It didn't help Latin American countries to accelerate the pace of economic growth. It benefited these conservative bloc or conservative elements to accumulate wealth, but it didn't help, the entire country to develop. So it was some sort of economic expansion during the 40 years that followed the independence or the liberation from the colonial authority, but it had some sort of lasting effect on the social structure. So again, these like narrow circle of landowners or oligarchical power, they maintained their powerful position socially and economically, and then left the rest of the country way too underdeveloped. And it didn't help like the national economies, to develop rapidly. But with this kind of expansion of export economy, in order to preserve their economic power, so these economic elites developed some interest in politics. So they started to develop some interest in national politics, especially with the expansion of this kind of export economy and the expansion of industrial bases. Some of previous landowner class, they managed, by making, the shift to industrial activities. So they made their way to transform their class position or their social position from landowners to industrial capitalists, as it happened in Chile and Argentina. So there had been it hadn't been some sort of fierce class struggle between landowners and industrialists in some areas, but in other areas like Peru and Mexico and Venezuela, for example, the landowners, they maintained or they limited their activities to agricultural sector, and with the expansion of industrial activities, a new capitalist class managed to or emerged, and they tried to gain some sort of political influence to preserve their economic power, or to serve actually their economic power. So it was kind of fierce class struggle between different components from the conservative bloc. So they developed some sort of interest in national politics. They tried to shield their economic power or economic activities by gaining some sort of political authority. So this kind of, in some context, this led to some sort of class struggle on the one hand, or the struggle between these economic powers and military leaders or caudillos on the other hand. So in some countries, alliance have some sort of alliances were formed in order to sort or to solve these kind of elite disputes, as it happened in Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. So the engagement of economic elites or the involvement of these economic powers in national politics led to some sort of accommodationist alliance between different elements in the oligarchical class, and between them and some military factions or military leaders. That happened in, as I mentioned, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, but in other countries, it took a form of power imposition. Some sort of dictatorship emerged in order to impose power and to quell any sort of elite struggle or agrarian struggle or resistance from popular classes. That happened in Mexico, Venezuela, and Peru. But in all cases, like either it was kind of, it took a form of accommodationist alliance from within, or in order to assert this oligarchical domination or power imposition in order to prevent or any sort of class struggle, or any movement, any popular movement to emerge in order to ask for, to put or to demand for, or to actually to pressure for, or to push for any sort of economic and social redistribution, basically from peasants in the rural areas. So it was sort of establishing dictatorship in order to quell or to preempt any emergence of these movements. So that happened through the 19th century until some sort of the social structure in the region was totally reshaped by these kind of expansion in activities, basically export and import growth. And the actually, in order to maintain or to sustain in order to guarantee this continuity of this large scale of economic activities, some countries did encourage, the advent of European immigration in order to increase, the labor force. So they didn't have enough domestic labor force. So that's why they invited some Europeans to come in order and to enter their labor markets. And with these sort of industrial expansion and industrial activities, many of the people used to live in the rural areas, they migrated to urban centers or to cities, in different Latin American countries, that gave rise to wide urbanization process. And this actually led to some sort of organization of the working class on the one hand, and now having Europeans that they were imbued, or they had their own ideals about, they were influenced by this anarcho-syndicalism ideals and anarchists and the organization of different popular sectors in order to organize, their activities and to push for some sort of economic and social reforms in the region. So they started to organize themselves in some urban centers, and they were deeply affected by this anarcho-syndicalism as an ideological or orientation, and this gave rise to extensive or wide labor mobilization that actually put the social question or the protection of labor rights and their with regard to their wages, minimum wages, or their bonuses, working hours, their bargaining position in relation to employers, their collective bargaining, their rights to strike. All of these issues, became immensely salient, and they tried to put it on the top of the political agenda. And this actually gave rise to reformist movement that asked for what was called popular incorporation, how to incorporate these popular interests basically of labor and then of peasants into the existing constitutional and legal framework. With this some sort of labor mobilization happening, and some sort of organization of trade unions, and in some areas peasant movements in the rural areas, they actually placed the social question or social and political reform actually in the top of the political agenda, as I mentioned. But the response of this of the oligarchical class was entirely different, or it differed actually from country to country, depending on the heritage or the legacy from post-independence period. So in some countries, basically Chile and Brazil, as I mentioned, as I mentioned, they had like this some sort of narrow liberal alliance. They managed to accommodate some interest of different classes in order to avoid radicalization and mobilization. So it actually it continued, you know, with the throughout the 19th century, with the emergence of this and the 20th century, with the emergence of labor mobilization and um, this sort of social and political, the demands for social and political demands. Um, so what happened in Chile, as they had their own, they developed from these kind of accommodations stand, they had their own parliamentary republic or experience, that the parliament had the responsibility for issuing laws and legal frameworks, and to like organizing any kind of political affairs. So this led to some sort of like political gridlock or stalemate, because the the intensification of these social and political demands for reforms were blocked by some conservative elements in the parliament. So with the intensification of the labor mobilization and the existence of some sort of programmatic parties inside the parliament, so they started to change their positions in order to de-radicalize and to demobilize the emergent labor class, or to demobilize these labor unions. So they actually incorporated these popular demands into the constitutional and legal, the existing constitutional and legal frameworks, basically under Alessandri in 1920. But the main purpose was to put an end to this mobilization, or to de-radicalize the political landscape. It didn't take any sort of populist coalition or alliance with these popular classes. They didn't. They had never been a part of the ruling coalition. So the main purpose was like to integrate them in order to mobilize, to incorporate, you know, to accommodate some of their interests and demands in order to de-radicalize, or to prevent their advance in the political landscape. So in Brazil, the establishment of the end of the monarchy and the establishment of the Republican Party by the end of the 19th century, it was like one of the major shift in the Brazilian politics. But actually, the Republican Party, unlike, you know, the programmatic parties in Chile, that these parties, they had a strong presence and existence on the national level. The Republican Party in Brazil, it didn't have any sort of national existence. It was like the main strong presence. It was localized and limited to regional basis. So that's why it was unable, you know, they didn't have this parliamentary traditions in order to incorporate labor demands or some of the popular demands into the legal and constitutional setting or configuration. So that's why it was until Vargas took power after some sort of political instability and the intervention of some military caudillos or military leaders with the help of some factions. And by the way, the both of the alliance and the incorporation happened with some sort of agreement with some factions inside the military. So the military still played important role in stabilizing or shaping, you know, these kind of political dynamics in the two countries. And the main target was again asserting social control and demobilizing labor forces. There was no kind of target to broaden the ruling coalition or to integrate labor and popular forces into the ruling coalition. In other countries, they followed like some sort of totally different trajectory or path. Mexico and Venezuela, the post-independence period marked by the emergence of dictatorships in order to impose their political will, and to actually to impose this some sort of political stability and political order. So they didn't have this kind of institutionalized parties that, or even like one dominant party that had like some popular basis in order to sustain or to maintain their grip on power. But what happened, it was like they imposed their own authority, like Gomez and Diaz in Venezuela and Mexico, respectively. But they didn't have like a strong control over peasants and movements in the rural areas. It was like, centralized power of landowners, but the national authority didn't have any sort of strong control over peasants there. So what happened when they actually the dictatorship like started to weaken, new social resistance movements started to emerge and to express some sort of discontent and dissatisfaction with the existing power structures. So in Mexico, Madero led this struggle, and in the beginning, it took a form of only, it was limited to some sort of political reform in order to ask for some sort of political liberalization or political opening, and to put an end to this Diaz period, and to ask for non-re-election principle. And actually these political reform demands echoed with the some sort of other social and popular demands from labor organizations and peasants movements. So it took a form of multi-reform movement in Mexico. It started out with Madero, that he had to reach or to build an alliance or to form some sort of coalition with the vibrant labor organizations, Casa de Obrero Mundial, and the Labor Party. It was like a strong party in Mexico, but it was like in organizing, these labor constituencies. So he reached out to labor organizations on the one hand, and peasants leaders or peasants movements on the other hand, in order to intensify, to exert pressure on Diaz to concede or to give in and to offer some political concessions. And all the efforts actually were culminated into the Mexican Revolution in 1911. With this kind of multi-class engagement or involvement. It took like ad hoc alliance between these forces. So labor, it didn't, like labor organizations, it didn't actually, the labor organizations actually, or labor, the labor leadership didn't actually like play, they didn't play the pivotal role in the revolution, but like because of this fierce elite struggle or elite divisions, so labor movement remained one of the potential social allies to this elite struggle in order to improve their bargaining position, or in order to broaden or their like social support basis in the face or while confronting with other elite factions. So the context of this elite struggles or elite divisions, they actually increased the bargaining position of labor organizations in order to ask for more social and radical reforms in order to give in return for their support to some political elites. So it was kind of a bargain between different elites and labor organizations. So regardless of their genuine or authentic belief in labor incorporation, so strategically they incorporated, some of the labor demands in order to increase their their political authority in the face of other competing or rival elites. So political elites adopted, these some sort of populist discourse, and to they shifted their orientation from reshape the political structure from this kind of narrow-based oligarchical rule to populist basis of support. So what happened, it was like non-accommodationist alliance between different, or the conservative elements or the conservative bloc, and the emerging populist elites or populist popular classes. So it was some sort of confrontational strategy and populist alliance between emerging new elites and popular sector, mainly labor and peasants. Dictatorship in Venezuela actually precluded any sort of populist alliance, or prevented, any sort of populist alliance from crystallizing until 1935. And it came mainly from a political reform movement in the opposition that actually transformed itself into political party, the Democratic Action Party in Venezuela. So this political movement, political opposition movement, that they had like this kind of opposing opinion in the face of the dictatorship, they managed to reach out to some reformist faction in the military in order to reshape the political landscape after the departure of the dictatorship. So they managed, with the help of the military faction or reformist military faction, to introduce or to push for some social and political reforms after the departure of Gomez. And in other countries during this reformist period and this fierce struggle for political and social reforms in Colombia and Uruguay, for example, the history or the post-independence period actually enabled two traditional parties to strike roots in society, basically among some rural notables and some rural and urban notables or elites. So it was kind of multi-class and multi-sectoral alliance they managed to establish after gaining independence. So what happened, it was some sort of political instability and caudillos rivalry in order to run the political affairs. So they managed to reach an agreement or to converge on some sort of elite pacts in order to reach political balance or political equilibrium. So some rural elites and urban elites, they had their own political parties, and they actually persisted into the post-independence period. So in Uruguay, Colorados represented the urban sectors, and Blancos the rural powers, social powers. And in Colombia, the liberal against the conservative parties, they actually represented this urban-rural dichotomy or divide as well. So they reached this kind of political agreement or political pact that no party would disturb, this political equilibrium by trying to appeal to popular sector, trying to introduce far-reaching distributive programs that would actually undermine the powerful interest of landowners in rural areas. So it was kind of a mutual agreement between both parties in order to stabilize the political system. They had to preserve their own the interest of their own electoral constituencies, and any kind of disturbance of this political equilibrium led to communal violence and civil wars in the countries. So because of this history of rivalry between different caudillos, and until these kind of two-party system gained their own shape in the post-independence period, it persisted into the popular or the reformist period or the popular incorporation period in 1920, 1930. So when actually any kind of progressive faction inside urban parties tried to introduce some radical reforms in order to incorporate the interest of the labor organizations or peasants movements that disturbed the power structure in these two countries, the conservative factions, even within the party that initiated the political reform, actually took a counter reaction in order to block any further reform and sometimes to reverse these reforms. In Peru and Argentina, this period gave rise to like vigorous labor mobilization and labor movement, and much more radical populist discourse or radical populism in these two countries. So what happened? These two countries, they had a strong existence of conservative class and regional elites that was the legacy of the post-independence period and actually from the colonial period. Because like the post-independence period didn't change much the social structure or the social landscape there. So like the existence of these conservative interests, they actually managed to block any sort of political and social reforms that would undermine their powerful economic and social interests. So with the emergence, what happened? They still they had especially Argentina, because of the industrial sector and the presence of European labor forces. So they started to mobilize some labor forces in order to ask for from anarchist perspective, in order to ask for radical social reform. So what happened? Conservative elites managed to absorb some of these social pressures back then, but without introducing any institutional guarantees or institutional and constitutional framework for these labor and social reforms. So what happened? It was like conservative class. It was cohesive and harmonious mainly in Argentina, and they were not that cohesive in Peru. But still, they managed to marshal their own power or economic resources in order to block any sort of proposals for social and political reforms. So in Peru, again, like the rural or the landowners, they still had the powerful position, but still they had like some sort of industrialist, especially in the sugar processing sector. So they had some sort of conflict that led to the incohesion in economic elites' interest. And with the emergence of some intellectuals that represented or started to infiltrate these socialist and anarchist ideas in the society, mainly Haya de la Torre and Maria Tige, they managed to attract or to organize labor organizations and later peasant movements and confederation around their parties, like the Aprista of Haya de la Torre and the communist of Maria Tige. So they started to, they gave kind of boost to a labor movement to organize themselves. And then in Argentina, with the emergence of the labor confederation, so they started to organize themselves in order to arrange or to maintain and sustain their mobilizing capacity or mobilizing power. So because of this change in the social and political landscape, so the conservative elites or conservative elements, they had to show some sympathy to these demands of popular sector. So Leguía in Peru introduced some sort of social and mild social reforms during 1919-1920. And in Argentina, Uruguay managed to, of the radical party that focused mainly on some institutional and administrative reform demands, that they didn't care much about social and political, like radical political reforms, showed some sympathy and tried to reach out to some labor organizations in order to stabilize the political landscape. So because of the existence of this powerful labor mobilization and the existence of powerful conservative class or conservative bloc, like neither like labor nor like conservative element had the ability to impose their own will, and this gave rise to a period of political instability and social violence and social conflict between different elements that led to successive coups in Peru, and the involvement of the military in Argentina in order to quell or to clamp down on the labor organizations or the labor forces. So this kind of mobilization, popular mobilization from labor and later from peasants in the rural areas, on the one hand, and the counter mobilization from the conservative elements on the other, it delayed, any kind of popular incorporation into the legal and constitutional setting in the two countries. So the emergence of this popular and reformist demands in the from 1916 till 1922 that led to a massive or major repression in Peru and Argentina. So in Argentina, for example, it led to what was called the Tragic Week, that the conservative elements, they formed their patriotic league that actually attacked some labor organization, some labor confederations, and they actually killed some workers' leaders that intensified, this antagonism between the conservative classes and the popular sectors, and this they put an end to this reformist period by initiating or taking harshly repressive measures in order to put an end to this class struggle or class conflict. So it was until 1930, 1940s until Prado like introduced some sort of social reforms and incorporated social demands and social reforms into the constitutional and the legal setting in Peru. And Juan Perón, I'm going to defer, this to the next week, because this is when we are going to talk about the populist regimes and how they actually gave way to bureaucratic authoritarianism, the installation of bureaucratic authoritarianism regimes, and like the intensification of this popular mobilization, mainly in Peru and Argentina. So what happened, it was kind of a delayed incorporation process because of the existence of this mobilization and counter-mobilization activities. And then that led to some sort of mild reforms and showing sympathy to popular demands while not introducing radical or institutionalizing these reforms until the mid 20th century. So, but the existence of this strong conservative elements like didn't fade away. So they still existed, and they still afforded some sort of counter mobilization that actually it took some sort of recurring patterns in political dynamics and the politics in two countries that led to successive like some period of successive military coups and establishment or installation of repressive military regimes in the two countries. And this actually, as we are going to see, led to in pro what's called a difficult game of transition. Even like in order to make a transition from bureaucratic authoritarian regime to democratic, it was a bit difficult because of the existence of this, the balance of forces between the two powers, the popular and the conservative. And in Argentina, it was some sort of, O'Donnell mentioned, impossible game of transition. So what happened, during the shape of the political and social landscape in the post-independence period, and actually whether or not it managed to persist in the reformist and popular incorporation period. It had important ramifications and implications for political transition and political, economic, and social distribution or distributional struggle in. It was after import substitution industrialization period, but I'm going to explain this in some detail later. So how like the arc of the social landscape and the intensity of the elite conflict and class struggle during that period affected the shape of the political regimes during the 1930s through 1970s and 80s, and then how it affected again the transition to political democracy and neoliberal market economy. Okay, as I mentioned, one of the main objective of this course is to learn how theories and conceptual framework, different conceptual frameworks in comparative politics can be applied to some empirical issues in Latin American politics and society. So what I was talking about, it was kind of historical events and legacy that shaped the political landscape and the process of regime formation and state building. It actually affected or carried over into post-independence period and even the popular incorporation period. And it shaped the institutional structure and the party systems in these countries. As I mentioned, in Chile, for example, this kind of accommodationist alliance between different conservative elements gave rise to this parliamentary politics and programmatic political parties that managed to restore or to keep the political equilibrium in the popular incorporation period, and they managed to incorporate some of the popular interest within the existing constitutional and institutional structure without disturbing, this balance. So they managed to de-radicalize and to demobilize the popular sector. So you have I'm not sure if you have heard of it before, but there is kind of a trend or a branch of the neo-institutionalism called historical institutionalism. And mainly the conceptual framework of path dependency. So what does this mean? It means when you have some sort of institutional pattern or a stable institutional pattern that survived or actually broke down by severe or radical changes at different critical junctures. So you need to see whether or not this represented or showed some sort of path dependent, or under what conditions these institutional structures managed to survive these traumatic and radical events. And in some other countries, these institutional patterns actually totally crumbled down or totally dismantled. So we need to see how the social and economic structures inherited from the colonial period or the structure of the polity in the post-independence period managed or survived this popular incorporation. Firstly, like helped to shape or to form the post-independence state first, and then how the state responded, or the existing institutional structure responded to the popular incorporation period and the mass mobilization period. So it's mainly I'm going to frame what I said, and to integrate this into some sort of theoretical or conceptual framework here. But before I do this, we need to define, the state and what kind of approach to state building I'm talking about. And actually, it's not me. It's one of the assigned reading by Kurtz. He adopted this society or sociological approach to state building, this society-based argument to state building in Latin America. So unlike the dominant conceptual framework about state building that actually widely or famously attached to Charles Tilly, like war-making states, and it mainly explained the emergence of, or the process of state building in Europe, and how like the engagement and involvement in external wars gave rise to strong administrative and extractive administrative apparatuses and extractive power of the monarchies. So because of, in order to sustain, to sustain their external wars, and in order to they had to maintain their extractive power, to impose taxes and to get some sort of funding in order to finance or to sustain their war activities. So that's why this gave rise to strong, administrative apparatuses in Europe, and it helped in constructing or building the state in Europe. But that was like different from what happened in other regions, and here we don't care about Latin America. So what happened, it was like different, like they followed different path or different trajectory depending on their own history of class struggle, or intensity of elite struggle, or even the legacy or of the colonial power. So like you have Tilly on the one hand, and you have different institutional approaches to state building. Like, for example, in order to sustain some sort of economic activities or to preserve property rights, the state had to establish some sort of legal framework in order to protect, these property rights, and subsequently to sustain and to improve economic activities and sustain economic and guarantee economic growth. But actually, Kurtz here, he argued against and he pushed back against, this explanation as well, and he tried to separate, the policy oriented notion of the state from institutional oriented approach to state building. So basically, when we speak of state building, so it was mainly on it was based on the Weberian notion or conception of a state building. So first it was like efficient, but not necessarily meritocratic, bureaucratic apparatus, and rational apparatus that put an end to this patrimonial or non-rational form of administrating or governing the country, and the legitimate use of violence, or the monopoly, the legitimate monopoly of use of violent coercive apparatuses. So no other like insurgency groups or no other actors, they had like any sort of legitimacy to use violence against, or against against different social groups, or against state, against any of the state apparatuses. So how to build this kind of central administration or central administrative structure is the key of the it's a central component of a state formation or state building. So how can we interpret the emergence of this central authority or central administrative structure in Latin America in the post-independence period? Um, so instead of adopting any kind of economic approach to this or policy approach to this, we need to take the analysis to the social structure or that was inherited from the colonial authority, and these kind of interaction between different social forces, it actually did condition the political and affected the emergence of this political and administrative institutions in Latin America. As I mentioned, it was some sort of continuity with this oligarchical power or oligarchical domination that managed to, they led the national liberation movements in order to preserve the inherited social order. So these institutions actually managed to survive the rupture of the post-independence period by if we look into the social composition of the national liberation movements or who led the national liberation struggle, it became like kind of obvious if we speak of the continuity of the same social structures in the post-independence period. But the rupture happened in the popular. It was a critical juncture because, as I mentioned, in some countries like Mexico and Venezuela, they reshaped the social and political landscape. So they actually changed the ruling coalition or the socioeconomic foundation of the ruling coalition. In other countries like Colombia and Uruguay, they sustained, their traditional parties, and they actually instrumentalized or used labor mobilization only for electoral support. So it was kind of ad hoc, collaboration between traditional parties and labor organizations. In other countries like Peru and Argentina, it took like some sort of like intensive class struggle between conservative class and popular classes and popular sectors that actually led to some sort of institutional breakdown in the two countries. So in path dependency, I do care about some sort of traumatic events and what's called critical junctures and the timing of this, like the post-independence period and this kind of growing social mobilization and labor mobilization, or in the popular incorporation period. So you have like two main critical moments or critical junctures. I'm going to add like the third wave of democratization and neoliberal turn as another or a third critical juncture in the history of Latin American countries. But for now, these are like the two main critical junctures that shaped, this the central, the structure of the central authority and the administrative structures in different countries that actually persisted into and continued into a long period of time. So what Kurtz tried to argue for. So basically, the very foundational and formative moment of state building in the post-independence period, it was like a challenging event. So you have to look into the local and regional elites and the relation or the structure of the economy in these countries. As I mentioned, it was like agrarian-based economy in order to sustain the agro export activities and some sort of commercial activities as well, in order to take advantage of the free trade agreements and the free trade policies. So like the dominant economic structure, the agricultural structure, was like one component, and the intensity of the elite struggle was like another component to look into in order to examine what sort of central administration and central authority emerged in some countries. So the first critical juncture regarding the state building trajectory, so you need to have a look, as I mentioned, to the structure of agrarian economies and the narrow circle of the oligarch, or the oligarchical power, and the agreement to centralize authority. So the main argument here, as I mentioned, it was there had been some sort of slavery system. So in some countries where like in Peru, for example, he actually compared between 4 countries: Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, and Peru, by looking into, in the first critical juncture, looking into the agricultural structure and the intensity of elite conflict. So if you have like this like a slave system and inter-elite conflict, like fierce struggle between different elites, it led to so you have like logically the local and the local and regional elites, they refuse to concede or to succumb to any sort of national authority that would undermine their powerful position and would modernize the agricultural structure, and to introduce, you know, some sort of technological or make any sort of economic advancement in the existing structure that would undermine their powerful position. So in these sort of like a slavery system, agricultural system, or mode of production, and inter-elite conflict, they together, you know, interact in order to prevent, you know, the emergence of central to concede or to succumb to a central national authority that would run the country's affairs after independence. It was the case in Argentina before, and it was also like it was the case, sorry, in Peru, and that led to some sort of decay, weak state institutions that actually dismantled over time. But when you have like free labor economy, like that happened, that was the case in Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. But unlike Chile, that they had this inter-elite cooperation, as I mentioned, that they managed to establish a strong central administration or central authority. And in Argentina and Uruguay, but it didn't last for so long. Like they conceded the regional authority, or the regional leaders, they managed to, or they accepted some sort of centralization of power, but it actually the conflict between different elites led to the dismantling of these central institutions over time. So in countries where they had this repressive agrarian economy or slavery agricultural structure, local elites, provincial elites, they were less likely to accept the authority of the central or the national government. So it was less likely to establish a strong central administrative apparatus, given, you know, the existence of these social forces. And when it comes to the national elites, when they had like this sort of, they managed to come to come to an agreement or a political settlement between themselves. So they managed to harmonize, you know, their interest, and they managed to. So what in order to demobilize the labor or the popular forces, they had to give some sort of political. Some sort of social reform without integrating them into the political dynamics. For example, in Chile, they didn't labor organization or labor class. They didn't have any kind of political weight because they didn't have like the right to vote. So that's why the state managed to neutralize, you know, any threat coming from these popular classes by making this kind of inter-elite settlement and centralized political authority. In the second critical juncture, which is, as I mentioned, popular incorporation period, so what happened with the surge or the growing power of labor mobilization and mass mobilization, So you have like in Chile, like the pre-existing institutional authority or central administrative authority or apparatuses managed to survive this critical juncture or critical event by incorporating, as I mentioned, some of the labor interests and labor demands into constitutional and legal frameworks. And they managed to harmonize the capitalist and labor interests. But in Peru as well, it was because of this fierce struggle, like the popular sector managed to sustain their or they had like this kind of mobilizing capacity, but the political institutions were weak. So that's why in the popular incorporation period or the Great Depression, after the Great Depression period and the economic crisis hit hard, so it was like endemic, what he called endemic institutional weakness that actually managed to or continued, with this post-incorporation period. So the pre-existing or antecedent conditions of this kind of weak institutional structures, it actually continued or persisted into the incorporation period or the Great Depression period. In Chile, they managed to sustain, this kind of state building and strong central authority and administrative structure. And Uruguay, as I mentioned before, after a period of this fierce rivalry between different caudillos, they managed to establish these co-participation or co-participatory structure between the two traditional parties, Blancos and Colorados. In Argentina, it was, as we are going to see, as I hinted at, and we are going to see in some detail next week, this post-incorporation period like that started in the era 1916 until 1922, until Juan Perón reached power and actually materialized, this kind of populist discourse and transformed this populist discourse into populist institutions. It led to the country actually had to vacillate or to oscillate between populist and anti-populist institutional configuration throughout history. So the main point here is how like institutions, like the inherited institutional structure or the legacy of particular institutions actually survived some sort of traumatic or critical events, and in some other cases that in these like theoretical or technical words they converged, and in other countries actually they diverged. So the point here, the institutional sediments, or the legacy of the post-independence period, by looking into or analyzing this through a society-based argument, would help you understand the continuity and discontinuity with the existing institutional patterns in Latin America with regard to state formation and regime change. We are going to talk more about this next week by elaborating more on regime types and how the transformation of social and economic structures at the second critical juncture of the Great Depression or the popular incorporation period gave rise to a different state development model that actually gave way to a long period of instability throughout the 1960s and 70s with the reconfiguration of the ruling coalition and the establishment of bureaucratic authoritarian regimes, and then until a third critical juncture emerged or came into being with the third wave of democratization, or another economic crisis in the 80s that actually reshaped again the political landscape and gave rise to a different regime type, different structure of party system, and some countries exhibited some sort of continuity and other countries actually followed a divergent path. Yeah, that's all for today, and I'm not sure who will like register in this course, but hopefully I'll see you next week. Bye.